In this video, we'll take a look at the firmware migration from Enterprise 14.1 parentheses 1 to 3PCC via CUCM for WebEx Calling. One thing to be aware is licensing is still needed for the firmware migration. In this video, we're focusing on the firmware migration for WebEx Calling, so the licensing will be virtual. Within WebEx Calling Control Hub, there's an option basically for doing firmware migrations under Services. So basically, bottom left corner, under Services, we're going to click Migrations, and then there's an option for Enterprise phones to multi-platform or MPP. The one other thing I was going to point out is if this is going to be for third-party call controller SIP servers that are not WebEx Calling, then please be aware there's other licensing that needs to be purchased for the firmware migration of the phones from Enterprise to 3PCC. And what you want to take a look at, there's a very good white paper. This white paper does get updated from time to time. It's a very detailed white paper. It covers the different licensing concepts of what's needed depending on what pathway you're taking. If you're doing WebEx Calling or if you're doing third-party call controller, has technical information, hardware, what hardware supported, including what hardware versions, and other really good resources. In any case, you want to take a look at that before attempting a firmware migration, just to understand what's supported, what's not supported. And then before we start the firmware migration with the phones, we want to make sure that the license is already generated on WebEx Calling Control Hub, the virtual license. So we want to log into WebEx Calling Control Hub, and then bottom left side under Services, there's Updates and Migrations, and then once we get into the section, there'll be a function or card, if you will, that's listed as Enterprise Phones to MPP firmware. And basically what we want to do here is we want to run a new task. And there's going to be a CSV file template, also CSV file user attributes will fill out. It's going to have basically, it looks like a small Excel sheet, and typically use Excel to fill out. One column is going to be the actual user that the phone is going to be associated with. The other column is going to be basically MAC address of the phone, site, phone model number. This case we're doing a Cisco IP phone 8832. If it's associated to a place, meaning like a meeting room, then you also want to include an extension for that. If it's associated to user, you want to leave the extension and the phone number blank. But in any case, once you go through the firmware migration tool, it's almost like using a wizard. Few steps. You want to get a status of ready for migration. That indicates that there's a virtual license that was created for the phone you want to migrate. So in this case, it's the 8832 phone we're migrating. Because if you don't have a green status, if it's like a red status, has some type of error, or you did not do this step, the firmware migration will not work. Okay, so with the 14.1 parentheses 1 firmware, basically the firmware migration is single step. We can go directly from Enterprise firmware to MPP firmware without using the transitional firmware load. So potentially that can cut down your firmware migration time by 50%, which can be a big deal if you have a large fleet of phones that you're trying to migrate and you're under a tight schedule. As we mentioned a moment ago, the migration does still require licensing. In this video, we're focusing on WebEx Calling, so please make sure what I showed you a few moments ago, that you get that completed, so you have a green status for the virtual licensing, because otherwise it will not work. Your firmware migration will fail. So just make sure that part is completed. It should be fairly quick to complete. So before 14.1 parentheses 1 Enterprise firmware, the firmware migration required basically two steps to occur. The first step was migration from Enterprise firmware to transitional firmware. That typically took about 5 to 8 minutes on average. And then once that was completed, the phone would reboot. It would go into runtime of the transitional firmware. And once in runtime of the transitional firmware, it would go in and download the 3PCC firmware. At the same time, it would do a validation check for the licensing with the WebEx Calling server for the firmware migration, and it will download the MPP firmware and then reboot again. And typically this older method of doing firmware migration, I was finding about 15 minutes plus or minus 5 minutes per phone, what typically I was seeing. Be aware if you have a larger batch of phones, since all these phones are going to be pulling this across your internet access, the time to do the firmware migrations can be stretched out quite a bit longer. So that's another area we're doing it. So the way we're going to show it here is we're actually downloading the binaries to CUCM, so it'll be localized. So the only thing that you'll be doing across the WAN here for the firmware migration process is the virtual licensing, which is a very small amount of information. And then once the phone is migrated, it does a handshake with WebEx Calling server to pull down its config, which is an XML format. Again, the information is very small. So this technique we're going to show here today potentially does have good benefits of increasing your firmware migration times, especially if you have a larger amount of phones. So going back to 14.1 parentheses 1 enterprise firmware or higher, the migration only needs one step for the firmware migration. So it's going directly from enterprise firmware 14.1 parentheses 1 to MPP, and the MPP firmware needs to be at least version 11.3.5 or higher. For this actual video I'm creating, demonstration today, I'm going to be migrating to 11.3.6, and the reason is that's what WebEx Calling server is currently running online. I could do 11.3.5, but that doesn't make sense, and it would work, because then what would happen is once the phones are migrated to 11.3.5 and they do a handshake, they come up in runtime, they do a handshake with WebEx Calling server, then it would go and download the 11.3.6 and reboot another time. So again, best approach is find out what firmware, MPP firmware, are the WebEx Calling servers running at the time you view this video, and just make sure you're migrating to that firmware. Obviously, you want to read the release notes, make sure there's no caveats, etc., etc. And then the next thing we're going to look here is another benefit with 14.1 parentheses 1 enterprise firmware. It bypasses the transitional firmware, and the reason this can help is there's certain new IP phone hardware versions which the older transitional firmware simply did not support. So if you're running into any issues where you have, for example, 7821 phones, 7841 phones, like they're brand new phones, you just recently purchased them, and you're trying to migrate and the migration is just simply not working, it could be because those phones are not, they're so new, they're not supported by the older transitional firmware. So this is another big potential benefit of using this new method of performing the firmware migration. We'll look at a chart in a few moments to give you a little bit more details on it. And then since it's using the local TFTP, in this case the CUCM, has a potential of yielding a faster migration when needing to migrate large groups of phones and or the customer site has limited internet bandwidth capacity. So obviously there are some customers where the internet capacity is not an issue, they have more than enough capacity, but more often not, a lot of customers, especially at the remote offices, may be limited to like 50 meg or 100 meg for internet access. And if you're trying to do a large batch of phones, like 50 phones or 100 phones, that can stretch out the firmware migration quite a bit, multi-hour type of situation. And in most of these projects, you're migrating the phones and you have a very tight window. Maybe you need to migrate them overnight. So one day they're on CUCM on-prem. Next day they need to be migrated to the cloud off-prem. And you need to, basically migration needs to occur overnight over the weekend. So this is where using the local CUCM and putting the binaries locally there may have a huge benefit. The other thing I should mention is if you're in a situation where the CUCM is offsite, like a data center, or if it's maybe at the main office, and there's an MPLS or a VPN tunnel, this may not help. You still may be limited by the WAN. I do have another video, I'll put in a description, a link to it, where it shows kind of the same methodology we're doing today, but without using CUCM, just using a generic third-party local TFTP server with an XML file. So you can set up there local in a remote office, and you can get the best performance possible for the firmware migration. I mentioned earlier, it's always key to look at the latest release notes regarding the firmware you're dealing with to understand if there's any caveats, any limitations, any special config requirements, etc. So for 14.1.1 firmware, this is the link right here for the release notes, and it's always wise to spend a little bit extra time ahead of time reviewing that to minimize any type of surprises. Okay, a few moments ago I mentioned if you have brand new phones, for example 7821 phones, 7841 phones, 7861 phones, and their version 18 hardware version or version 20 hardware version, most likely if you're trying to use the older method of the firmware migration with the firmware transition load, then you most likely are running into issues. It's failing. It's just simply not working. So this is where bypassing the transitional load using this method I'm showing today can address this limitation. So just be aware, you may want to take time you're viewing this video, you may want to take a look at the most recent compatibility guides. They also have one for the 8800 phones. This one just happens to be for the 7800 phones. Just to understand if there's any minimum hardware versions that are required for the firmware migration, depending which phone you have and depending the time you're viewing this information. And then the other item we want to take a look at is what is the minimum, or what specific models of phones and what are the minimum hardware versions of the phones that support the firmware migration. The three specific phones we want to take a look at here that are of consideration, special consideration, is the 7821, the 7841, and the 7861 phones, respectively version 3 or higher, version 4 or higher, and version 3 or higher. So if you have phones that are older, so if you have 7821 phones or maybe version 1 or version 2, that hardware simply does not support the firmware migration. Likewise, as for the 7841, if you have something that's below version 4, like version 3, 2, or 1, that would not support the firmware migration. Likewise, 7861, if it's below version 3, like a version 2 or 1, it would not support the firmware migration. So just be aware there is minimum hardware version required for these phones. And you may also have other phones that are simply not listed on this chart as being eligible devices for firmware migration. So if you're doing a firmware migration project, definitely this should be one of the first charts you look at. This is the white paper that's available, the following URL down here. It's a quite large document, but at the same time, it's a wealth of information. The document does get updated from time to time, so you definitely want to visit it from time to time as you're doing different firmware migration projects, just to see what the latest and greatest is as far as hardware support, firmware support, any type of new type of notes or techniques for the migrations. Okay, our setup's going to be fairly straightforward. We have a CUCM server. It's at 192.168.1.180. And it's going to be basically the TFTP server with the firmware files. The specific files we're interested in is, one, we want to make sure the phone that we're migrating has 14.1.1 firmware. So that's right here, the 8832 phone. And then, so that's what it's currently running. But then what we're targeting is we want to basically migrate this phone and prep it for the WebEx Calling service. So we want to migrate it over to 11.3.6 firmware, which I also have here. So right now this is on CUCM under Cisco Unified OS Administration right here. And then basically to see this, we're going to go over to software upgrades, and then inside that menu there's an option for TFTP file management. And then what I did here basically is I did file name contains, and then I just typed in 8832 and I did a find, and that shows all the files associated to 8832. So one thing to be aware is the files for the MPP software, is available as zips. So when you download it from the Cisco site, it says .zip. You're probably accustomed to COP files or .cop files for binaries that you upload to CUCM, because that's traditionally what you would get the binaries in, and you would upload it to CUCM to update it for new phones or new firmware, etc., etc. Well, in this case, .cop is not available for the MPP phone. So the way we would update the CUCM with the needed binaries for the MPP firmware is basically we would go to the Cisco OS Administrator, and then we would go to the software upgrades. We would then go to TFTP file management, and then once we get to this page, there's an option to upload file. And then what we want to do is we get this child window that pops up here. We want to click Browse. Then we're going to get another child window. We're going to go to the subdirectory where we downloaded it and unzipped the actual binaries. And in this case, I'm showing 11.3.5, but I did the same thing for 11.3.5 or 11.3.6, excuse me. So basically, and one thing to note, we can't select all of this concurrently. We have to do one at a time. So the pattern is as follows. We go in and select the first file. We click Open. We click Upload File. Then we'll get a message that it's been uploaded. Then we hit Browse again. We click the second file here. We click Upload. We click Open, we click Upload. We'll get a message it's uploaded. We hit Browse again. We hit the third or select the third file. Open, Upload, Browse again. Fourth file selected. Open, Upload, Browse again. Last file selected. Open, Upload file, and then we'll hit Close. So it's a little bit redundant, but it's not that difficult. Okay, so the next thing we need to do, now that we have the needed binaries uploaded on the CUCM server that's acting as a TFTP server, so I should also mention, in your cluster, if you have specific servers that are acting as a TFTP server, then you want to make sure you do this process for the respective servers that are acting as a TFTP server as far as uploading the binaries. The second part of it is going to be going into the Cisco Unified Serviceability. And then here we're going to basically go under Tools, and then we're going to select Control Center Feature Services, and then we're going to basically make sure we have the right server in the cluster selected that's running the TFTP service. We're going to go in and select the TFTP service, and then we're going to basically tell it to restart. And at that point, we're going to get a message, and in my generally my lab testing, 30 seconds or so, it comes back fairly quick. If this is a production environment, obviously you'd want to do this in a maintenance window, depending what your policy is, since production, a lot of phones, etc., etc. But in any case, once a service restarts, and you want to do this for all the respective servers who are going to be hosting these binaries and acting as TFTP servers, you should be ready to take the next step. And the next step, basically, we're logging into CUCM to the CM administration section of the server. We're going to go to bulk administration. We're going to go to phones. We're going to go to update phones. We're going to go to query. And then here what we're going to do is we're going to select device type. We're going to select contains, and I'm going to type in 8832. And be aware, in your environment, you may select other fields to search for. It might be site, it might be username, floor, however your naming convention is structured and the phones you're targeting for firmware migration. Use the respective fields that make sense. Then we're going to hit find. I only have one of these phones on my CUCM. And just be aware, in your situation, it should say registered. The reason this is unregistered is I took this screenshot right after I started the firmware migration. I went back and wanted to get a screenshot of this. But in any case, in your case, it should say registered. You'll hit next. And then on this page, what we want to select is the radio button. It says restart phone. Then we're just going to go down the page via the vertical bar here. And we're going to get to a section that says phone load name. We're going to select this. And then when we type in the specific binary we want to, or firmware we want to migrate the phone, one thing that comes up sometimes as a question is, do we need to do the downloads extension? Normally when we're dealing with the enterprise side of telephony, we do not. It automatically knows it. If we're dealing with the 3PCC, so let's pretend this was not CUCM, but we're actually logged in directly to a 3PCC phone via the web GUI, and we're doing something on the phone itself directly, like a new firmware loads, then typically we do need to put the extension downloads. What I found is, if you notice, I experimented with both scenarios and it worked just fine. So in any case, we're going to go ahead and we want to upgrade to 11.3.6 for the binary. So it should look like this. So we have that entered in. We have this selected for the phone load name. And then basically we're going to go down a page. We're going to select run immediately right here. We're going to then select submit. And basically at this point of time, what we should have is the phone's going to start downloading the binaries, the 11.3.6 MPP binaries to it directly. And once it finishes downloading, then it'll be ready to do a reboot. And you'll get a message that says ready to upgrade. And then the device will start in X amount of seconds and it'll reboot. And then once it's rebooted, basically it'll go ahead and once it comes up in runtime of 3PCC firmware, in this case 11.3.6, it does a handshake with WebEx Calling server, and then it'll actually start downloading config. And it may take like 2 minutes or so for it to download the config and for it to show the actual extension number, the phone number, the username, etc., etc. In any case, we'll take a look at here next. Okay, we're now in WebEx Calling Control Hub. And we're going to look at the updates and migrations and then take a look at the actual tool for the firmware migration. And we just want to verify that the phone that we're going to be migrating, that the tool is showing that it has a green status, meaning there's a virtual license created for this phone. If this is not a green status, if it's like a red status or this has not been completed yet, then the firmware migration will not work. So make sure you completed this. Okay, we'll take a look at the phone information to see what the phone's at right now. It's 8832. And okay, so it has older enterprise firmware, so we need to bump up the firmware before we can actually do the firmware migration. We'll just make sure it's registered. It is registered to CUCM with dial tone. Okay, so next we're going to do is we're going to bump up the firmware. Okay, we're going to go back to CUCM here. And what we're going to basically check is to see what firmware we have on the server, on the CUCM server, and then we're going to bump up the firmware from the 14.0.1 up to 14.1.1 to prep the phone for the firmware migration. Okay, we're going to go software upgrades, TFTP file management, and then we're going to go ahead and type in the phone type. So there's a couple different ways you can do it. This is in a lab environment, so I'm just going to basically, I only have 188.32, so I'm just going to use this method of locating. Okay, so if you notice here, we have 11.3.6 MPP firmware. I also have the older 11.3.5 MPP firmware. I was doing testing with a couple different versions, as you can see. And then the other firmware we want to look at is going to be the enterprise firmware, because we need to bump up the phone. So it currently has 4.01, but we want to bump it up to 14.1.1 firmware. So we're going to go ahead and do that next. We're going to go ahead and copy the name of this downloads file. And then this is, so on this obviously I've already uploaded all the files, but as I shown earlier, if we need to upload files, we just have to recursively go and grab all the files one at a time and upload it to the actual CUCM TFTP server. Okay, what we're going to do now is we will go over to phones. We'll go ahead and find the phone we're looking for. Okay, the phone, as you can notice, is listed as registered. It's the very bottom phone right there. And what we're going to do next here is we need to go ahead and update the enterprise firmware. So we're going to go phones. We're going to go down to update phones, query. We're going to go ahead and type in 8832. Whoops. So we're going to type in 8832. And then we're going to contains. Oh, let me do that one more time here. We're going to change this to device type. Okay, and then we'll find again. Okay, so that's our phone 8832. We want to update from older enterprise firmware to newer enterprise firmware to prep it for the migration. We're going to select restart phones. We're going to scroll down until we get to the phone loads name, and then we're going to go ahead and add the 1411 phone loads name. Okay, so we're going to enable phone load name. Then we have the actual name of the loads we want. Okay, we're going to go to the very bottom, and we're going to go ahead and run immediately, and then we're going to submit the job here. Okay. And we're going to take a look at the phone right now, see what's happening on the phone itself. Okay, the phone's rebooting right now. Okay, it's detecting network. And typically this will take a few minutes. We'll see the screen come on and off at different points of time with different information. Okay, it looks like the phone just came back here. Let's see what the settings say. We'll go down to system information. Okay, that's our 8832, and it has 14.11 firmware. Great. Now it's ready for the firmware migration to 3PCC. Okay, we're back on CUCM. We're going to go to the OS administrator. Okay, software upgrades, TFTP, file management, contains, we're going to type in 8832. Okay, we're going to go ahead and copy the loads name that we want to load into the phone itself. Okay, so that's 1136 MPP firmware. Okay, we're going to go back to the call manager administrator, and we're going to go over to the bulk administration, phones, and then we're going to go down to the update phones. We're going to do a query. Okay, contains, and then we're going to do it by device type. Okay, and let's try that one more time. Contains, and let's hit find. Okay, there's our phone, and we're going to go next. Okay, we're going to select restart phones. We're going to go down to the loads section. Okay, we're going to enable phone load name, and then we're going to paste the load that we're going to do, which is 1136 MPP firmware. And then we will go ahead and go to the bottom section of this. So we'll go all the way to the very bottom here. And we're going to tell it to run immediately. And we're going to go ahead and submit this. Okay, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the phone now. Okay, the phone's rebooting. When you're doing these firmware migrations, as I mentioned earlier, go ahead and do 1 or 2 phones initially just to make sure the workflow everything's working correctly. And then also make sure physically somebody's at the location, if it's a remote location or different part of the building, that they can actually look at the phone, and if the phone needs to be factory reset or any troubleshooting. And then as you do successful runs progressively, go ahead and do larger and larger batches up to a level where you feel comfortable that you're able to execute enough quantity of phones to meet whatever time criteria you have. But also not to do too many phones concurrently if an issue occurs, and if there's a problem, you're able to troubleshoot. Okay, so it looks like configuration check is in progress. Okay. So right now it should be doing a handshake with the WebEx Calling server. And what we'll do is that the handshake may take a minute or two to complete, so we'll just take a look at the settings to see what the phone currently has on it. So we'll go down to status, product information. Okay, see, 3PCC, awesome, and it's 11-3-6 MPP firmware, awesome. So now we just need to wait until it completes doing the handshake with the WebEx Calling server, and it downloads the config, and at that point it should be ready. It should have dial tone, and it should be able to accept and generate calls. So let's just give it a few moments. Okay, it looks like it's completing here. Okay, so it has the extension now, has the phone number, PSTN phone number, and we should have dial tone. So if we press the new call button, we should get dial tone. We do, awesome. Okay, well, that kind of completes the firmware migration. Hopefully this video helps you. Thank you.